At the Goldwater Institute, we've been working to put an end to release time. We're excited to have you join us for a conversation about this costly practice and what we're doing about it. With us today, we have Mark Flatten, Goldwater's national investigative journalist. Mark spent more than 25 years as a political and investigative reporter at Arizona newspapers before joining the Goldwater Institute in 2009. He left the Institute in 2012 to become an investigative reporter at the Washington Examiner, where he exposed scandals of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Mark returned to Goldwater in December 2014. Most recently, he's been reporting on release time and peeling back the curtain on how big the problem is. We also have John Riches. He's the director of national litigation for the Goldwater Institute's Sharf Norton Center for Constitutional Litigation. John litigates in federal and state and appellate courts in the areas of economic liberty, regulatory reform, free speech, taxpayer protections, public labor issues, government transparency, and school choice, among others. John has been fighting release time in court, including in New Jersey, Texas, and Arizona. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for this conversation.
Thanks for having us, Mike.
John, I'm going to kick it off and start with you. You've been at the front lines fighting release time. Can you tell us more about what release time is, why it's illegal, and why it's such a big problem for our country?
Sure. Yeah, I think a good way to think about it is imagine for a moment if your local city council or school district said that they were going to release their government employees, teacher, firefighter, police officer, blue-collar worker, and rather than perform the job they were hired to perform for the government, they're going to release them to any private parties. Take your pick. Let's say Walmart. They're going to give six government employees to Walmart. Walmart can use them as Walmart sees fit. They can stock shelves or serve as greeters or checkout clerks or whatever, all the while being paid their government-funded salaries, including benefits like guaranteed overtime, pension benefits, et cetera. I think if someone were to describe that sort of arrangement to you, Mike, you might rightfully be appalled, and I think most of the public would rightfully be appalled. Well, that's precisely what's happening with release time. But rather than releasing these government workers to work for Walmart, the government at all levels, federal, state, and local, are releasing government workers to go and work for private labor unions. And while they're doing that, while they're on release time, they're doing things like political activities. So advocating for the election or defeat of certain political candidates, lobbying activities, trying to advance legislation that promotes union interests, recruiting new members, filing costly grievances against their employers, and collective bargaining. The list goes on and on. There's all forms of release time. You have full-time release, where an employee is literally released full-time from any of their government jobs. You have a bank of hours. You have issue-specific release. But at the end of the day, why is it a problem? For a few reasons. One, it's terribly pervasive. As I mentioned, it exists at all levels of the government. State and local government are some of the worst offenders. The federal government spends upwards of $150 million a year on release time. And there's a structural problem with this, right? Government resources should be put to public use. It shouldn't be put to advance the purely private interests of private organizations, particularly private organizations that can have such broad impact on public policy because of the collective bargaining process and labor unions' political activities. So it raises all sorts of public policy questions. And then, of course, it raises legal questions, which we'll probably have the opportunity to talk about.
Mark, you dug deeply into this. Last year, you released a series of reports on release time. Your first report was titled Money for Nothing. Taxpayer-funded release time gives government employee unions no work and all pay. Can you tell us more about what you sought to uncover in your report, and what did you find?
Well, yes. Goldwater has done a research on release time in the past. As John mentioned, we've done litigation in multiple states. But the problem is nobody really knows how extensive release time is because no one has ever really tried to quantify who's allowing it, where's it being allowed, that sort of thing. So what we decided to do is try to get a handle on how extensive release time is. It's in state and local jurisdictions, because frankly, that's where most of it is occurring. So we filed public records requests with the state departments of corrections, the capital cities, and the largest school districts in each state, just to kind of get a sense of what patterns we might find. So out of that 150 jurisdictions total, we identified more than 408,000 hours annually in taxpayer-paid release time of union officials who are employed by their government. We found that 82 of them were able to actually document the release time in terms of hours. Less were able to document the costs. But one of the more surprising findings is how many jurisdictions don't even bother to track it. 68 of that 150 basically have no idea how much release time they allow. So in those instances, we had to go back and analyze their individual contracts to try and get a sense of, okay, what's in this contract? How much release time is allowed? How do we start putting a number on these hours that union officials are released from their taxpayer-funded jobs to do exclusively union work? And we found that in many jurisdictions, multiple public employees are released full-time to do absolutely nothing but union work all year long. For instance, Phoenix contracts allow upwards of 24 employees from the various unions to be released full-time. Again, that means they do no government work. They do strictly union work. Just in our review of contracts, we were able to identify at least 16 jurisdictions that have at least one full-time person on full-time release, and most of those have multiple people. So we identified at least 61 positions in the agencies we looked at that had people that are 61 positions that were on full-time release in these various jurisdictions.
So Mark, that 408,000 hours, that's just a crazy high number, and the cost that you report was around $10 million. Does that come anywhere close to being a full accounting of just how widespread this is?
No, it doesn't. Just quickly on the cost, I mean, the cost is almost meaningless, because even jurisdictions that do make an attempt to track the hours typically don't track the cost. So they really aren't able to put a figure on it. But even among the jurisdictions that do have some method of tracking release time, not all of it is necessarily quantified as release time. So, and particularly for those that don't track it, that don't have any mechanism to figure out how many hours are we allowing our unions to take in release time, it gets very problematic for a couple of reasons. Even if there are limits in a contract that says, this individual is allowed 1,000 hours of government paid release time, the fact is, if you're not tracking that and there's no accountability for that, there's really no way to know how many hours that individual is taking. So any limits in the contracts that may be identified, if they're not enforced and if they're not tracked, they really are kind of meaningless. Another problem we came across was sort of open-ended language, where there's just really effectively no limit on release time. Just for example, pretty standard language in a lot of these contracts allow top union officials to be released from their government jobs during contract negotiations. Well, most of them don't put a limit on how long those negotiations can take. Many of them don't put any kind of limit on how many union officials can participate in those negotiations. So there's really effectively no cap on that. Another example is pretty standard language in these contracts allows union stewards to be released from their jobs with pay to conduct grievance procedures, grievance investigations, grievance hearings. But there are no limits on how much time they can take to do that. And then another factor that makes it very difficult to quantify this, particularly in the agencies that don't have any mechanism to track it, is this notion of what is reasonable. For instance, in Salt Lake City, the head of the police union is allowed to take a reasonable amount of time to conduct union business while on duty. Well, they don't define reasonable, and they don't track the hours and cost of that quote unquote reasonable release time. So again, effectively, there is no way to quantify that because they don't bother to track it. They don't clearly define what is allowed. And so it's kind of an open-ended thing. I will say that in our analysis, we were very conservative. So unless we could identify specific numbers of hours, we didn't count them. So things like reasonable and things like undefined hours, those didn't get counted in our tabulations.
John, your case in Austin really illustrates just how egregious this problem is. Firefighters are getting paid not to fight fires. It's unbelievable. Can you tell us about that case?
Sure. Yeah. So when you think about maybe some of the most important public functions, I think a lot of people will naturally think of public safety, firefighters, police, EMS. Unfortunately, what we found is that oftentimes public safety employee labor unions are some of the worst abusers of release time. So in the city of Austin, what we found is that they allowed the union president full-time release. So rather than serve as a fire chief, he was released full-time to work for the labor union. And then they also gave him essentially carte blanche over a bank of release time hours that was the equivalent of 3 other full-time positions. So rather than serving in the firehouse, the union could pull employees out to engage in purely private union activities, things like political activities, lobbying, grievances, recruitment, contract negotiations, the stuff that Mark was talking about a little bit earlier. So that raises a legal question. About 49 states, almost every state in the country has what's called a gift clause in its state constitution. And that is basically an anti-subsidy protection. What it says is that, look, the government can't spend public funds unless the expenditure is for a public purpose and the government gets back roughly proportional value. So if government spends $1 million, it's got to get roughly that back in return. If that's what it's putting out, it's got to get that back in the form of a product or service. And importantly, the government also has to control government expenditures. If the government's going to spend our money, if the government's going to spend taxpayer money, it has to know where it's going and have adequate control over it. So what we found in Austin, and frankly in many places, is that once release time is granted, there is no control. It's just given to the union, the release time employees, and they can use it however they see fit. In the city of Austin, the evidence established that the city didn't direct the union's president's activities, didn't place any prohibition on his activities. He didn't need permission before he engaged in any activities. He wasn't required to report to the city, wasn't required to provide an accounting of his time in any meaningful way. No one supervised him, although every other city employee had a supervisor. Nobody provided a performance evaluation, although every other city employee up into the highest levels of government all received a performance evaluation. So there was essentially no control over his activities. And that unfortunately is quite common where we've seen this practice and raises gift clause issues. And then there's also some other legal issues that maybe we'll have a chance to talk about in some of our other litigation.
So we have a question from the audience that's particularly on point here. Do these release time employees perform any functions that the unions could not hire outside employees to perform? Like, why is this something that the public employees have to do?
Yeah, I think the caller puts his or her finger on it directly. Who should be paying for this, right? I mean, that's the question. Can public employees organize into labor organizations and engage in union activities? Sure, but who should be paying for the release time? And here, there's no question who should be paying for it. It should be the private union because these are private union activities. It shouldn't be the public. And it shouldn't be the taxpayer. So, of course, many of these unions have large budgets. They get millions of dollars every year in voluntary union dues. And these sorts of activities can and should be paid out of the union's funds. Now, could the city also hire third parties to do this sort of stuff? Of course, yeah. Contract negotiations, you could hire, third parties to do that. Grievances, disciplinary actions, absolutely. I mean, that's sort of quintessential representation type stuff that a third party could do. So, yeah, that would be another option as well. But the person who shouldn't be paying for it is the taxpayer.
John, thanks for that answer. And just as a reminder to everybody, if you have a question, there's a group chat box on the bottom of your screen that you can click on and enter your question there, or you can email your question to events@goldwaterinstitute.org. Mark, in your reporting, you talk about some jurisdictions use tricks to hide their release time. And one of the most ridiculous stories is out of Providence, Rhode Island. Can you tell us about what you found there and about how other jurisdictions hide their release time?
Absolutely. In reviewing the Providence contract, I came across this section dealing with the union president. And it doesn't say he's on release time. Instead, it says he's assigned a car 76. Now, car 76 has a few restrictions. The person in that car can't be assigned any hours. They can't be assigned any duties. They can't be assigned any posts. They can't be called out in an emergency. And yet they're carried on the payroll as a patrol officer. Even though in speaking with the union president there, he said, I haven't been out on patrol for years. In fact, since he became the union president, his sole duty is to do union work and not to serve as a patrol officer. And again, this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, is a lot of these jurisdictions don't call release time. They call it something else. One of my favorites is in Nashville, where the head of the police union is assigned as the labor liaison to the chief. And so that's not really considered release time. He's assigned there full time. And yet that's not really considered release time by city officials because that's his official duty, to serve as the labor liaison. Something very similar in Denver, where the police and fire union heads are allowed to do union business while on duty. And the city does not consider that release time because as far as they're concerned, those union presidents are still on duty. Salt Lake City is another good example, which I mentioned before, is the allowed to do reasonable amount of union work on government time. But my favorite, even better than the car 76 issue, is in the Sioux Falls, South Dakota school district, where union officials, union stewards representing employees in grievances who are released with pay are told to log those hours as court or jury leave. So there are all kinds of tricks, and that makes it very difficult to identify these release time positions. And that's not even counting some other clearly underhanded things like side agreements, which are made outside of the formal contract, essentially a letter between the city and the union saying, yeah, we'll let these guys be on full-time release. Or in some cases, just by custom. There's no written requirement or written agreement that allows the full-time release. It just is by custom and practice. They just have historically allowed it.
One of our listeners, I think, is reading my mind. They asked my next question: why would the municipalities even agree to this?
Well, the argument that they make is sort of this argument they call labor peace, which is if we don't want trouble with the unions, and this allowing full-time release gives us a conduit to the unions, and so that we can resolve any of these issues internally, and that's going to save us a lot of formality and essentially a lot of potential lawsuits. And even at its most extreme, potential employee strikes. The reality is that doesn't happen. One of the other interesting findings in my research is that out of these 150 jurisdictions we surveyed, 44 of them do not allow release time. And these are jurisdictions large and small. And so when you make the argument that you can't have labor peace without release time, or you can't have an effective labor management relationship in your city or in your school district without full-time release or part-time release, I look at those 44 jurisdictions that don't have it, and they still seem to be functioning quite well. Another argument that gets made for it, and I know John will probably want to talk about this in more detail, is, well, this isn't really a gift or a giveaway to the unions. This is really just part of the overall negotiation package. And if we got rid of release time, it really wouldn't save the city or the school district any money, because that money would just be going to other employees anyway, which is problematic. And as John, I'm sure, will explain in greater detail.
Yeah, I think a couple.
John, yeah, to that point, John, I wanted to point out to our listeners, like, if you don't know, Goldwater Institute really is the national leader in this. And earlier this month, John published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled "The New Jersey Teachers Who Get Paid Not to Teach." It's a huge story. It's making national headlines. And John, what does that case say about the point that Mark was just making? And can you tell us more about it?
Yeah. So taking up this labor peace question, which also came up in the New Jersey case. So of course, the unions and the municipalities might argue that release time somehow creates better labor relations. So one, there's a legal problem with that. When release time is agreed to, nothing else about it is generally agreed to. So in the contract, it's not like it says the union, shall meet with management on these days, shall represent people in these grievances, shall do A, B, C, D, E. These contracts just set the union employees free to do whatever they feel is in the union's interest. So it's not actually bargained for, which is a legal problem. But look, we know that that's not actually what happens. In our New Jersey case, for example, the union was making the same argument about labor peace. And at the same time they were making this argument, the Jersey City School District, which is the entity that is part of the case, and the union struck. And they had to walk out, and they shut down school services long before the coronavirus pandemic. So they had argued that release time is really promoting labor peace, while at the same time, 2 full-time teachers, rather than teaching students, were instead encouraging a strike among teachers, which hadn't happened for quite some time. So the labor peace argument didn't seem too compelling in that context. But look, what's really happening? Why the question is, why do municipalities agree to this? The reason they agree to it is because labor unions are extraordinarily powerful politically, particularly at the local level. And so you have a labor union that goes to a city council person or a city council candidate, solicits, the candidate will solicit their endorsement. The labor union will endorse them, and then the city council person will turn around and confer lavish benefits on the labor union, including release time benefits, for political purposes. And then that serves both parties' functions, and taxpayer doesn't have a seat at the table at all. So that's really what's happening here. It's really a kind of a nasty symbiotic relationship between the labor unions and the folks that they elect. Just one other point on the release time case out in New Jersey. That one is particularly particularly interesting because you had 2 full-time teachers that, rather than being in the classroom and teaching, were released to go and work for the union. And New Jersey has a gift clause. So like we were talking about earlier, that creates a public expenditure for private purposes. But their state law, like most states, say that, look, school districts, they can only do things that the legislature authorizes them to do, right? Local governments can only do things if the legislature has delegated authority to them to do. And the legislature has never delegated authority to school districts to do this type of activity, to grant major public expenditures on something like release time. So that case raises some interesting statutory questions as well. We had a win in the Court of Appeals in that case. We argued it before the New Jersey Supreme Court several months ago, and we're anticipating a decision sometime in the near future here.
Mike, if I could add just one thing. One of the things to keep in mind about release time is this is a benefit for the union bosses. This is not really a benefit for the rank and file. And so when the top union officials go and sit down to negotiate that contract, the first thing they're going to preserve is their release time. And from the management standpoint, from the city manager or school superintendent standpoint, it's an easy giveaway for them. As John said, you've got political factors that the unions are very powerful, particularly at the local level. But beyond that, if I'm a superintendent or a city manager and I can keep my union, my top union officials happy, and they can keep their people happy, that makes my job a little easier. It's not necessarily a good investment for the taxpayers, but I can go home at 5 o'clock without labor headaches every day. And so for upper management, that becomes a pretty easy giveaway, especially if you've got a city council or school board that is in itself very, very union friendly and very beholden to the unions.
John, besides fighting release time in court, are there legislative solutions to this problem?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the state and local level, state legislatures could certainly put in place a statute or a law that prohibited or eliminated release time. Laws have been introduced in a few states along those lines: Washington State, Arizona, I think one or two others. So state legislatures can preempt local entities from doing this, and that's very good public policy. We've developed some model policy along those lines. Municipalities could do the same thing. They could put in place ordinances that don't allow this type of thing. That could be done through voter initiative, could be done by a city council. And then, of course, this can just not be negotiated. Whoever the entity is that's granting release time, whether it's a school district or a municipality or whatever, they don't have to agree to this. They don't have to award the union these types of gifts. So they can decide not to put them in collective bargaining agreements. And frankly, I think because of the type of work that Mark's been doing and others, making this more of an issue now that more policymakers are aware of this issue, that the public is aware of these sorts of abuses. Hopefully more and more we're going to see policy solutions coming out, eliminating or curtailing the practice.
So we have another question from the audience asking, is the release time problem expanding, and how fast is it expanding?
Yes, it is. In fact, several states have really moved towards expansion of the release time. In California, Governor Newsom vetoed a bill that was passed, but it is still being pushed that would essentially mandate it. And I believe in Oregon, the governor just within the last year signed a bill essentially mandating local jurisdictions, cities, school districts, to make provisions for, again, quote unquote, reasonable release time, which is undefined. And one of the staff, the legislative reports before the bill was passed, they did a financial analysis, and they said there really is no way to do a financial analysis because there is no particular limit on this. Define reasonable. There's no cap on the hours. So that was one of the concerns raised. They ended up passing it anyway. Virginia, which had historically not allowed collective bargaining, is later this year going to be allowing collective bargaining. There have also been movements in a lot of cities, a lot of school districts to essentially get around state restrictions by, for instance, in Fairfax County, Virginia, I believe, despite the prohibition there, they had a policy, district policy that allowed it. So there are any number of ways that release time is expanding. Again, largely because I think the public really doesn't know much about it. It's something that gets negotiated typically in these closed union contract negotiations. When the contracts come before the city council, the media tends to focus on, how big of a pay raise is the police department going to get. They don't focus on the nitty-gritty details of release time. So the public's largely unaware of it. And hopefully the work we're doing here at Goldwater and some other organizations around the country will help raise that awareness and let people know, hey, your tax dollars are paying for this stuff. Your tax dollars are being used to fund this private organization, which is a public employee union.
John, I know this is something you talk about a lot and you focus on in your work, is that it's that expanding power of the unions. How does release time fit into that? And, how should we be thinking about, those expanded areas of union power in local government and federally, and where is that connection with release time?
Sure. Yeah. And I want to make a distinction too. I mean, between public sector labor unions and private counterparts. We're talking about public sector unions here and public expenditure of public funds. And look, money's fungible, right? So if you get, you have $100 in your right pocket and $100 in your left pocket, you got $200. And the union is going to have money from union dues, which up until the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in mandatory in Janus could be mandatorily compelled in about half the states. So they're going to have their own set of money, which is an enormous war chest in many cases. And then they're going to have this stream of taxpayer-funded or unit-funded release time hours so that they can engage in certain union activities while utilizing the taxpayer dime. And then they save all the money that maybe they would have been utilizing, engaging in those types of union activities, and they deploy it for things like political activities and lobbying. So release time is, in a very real sense, expanding the power of government labor unions, and by extension, of course, expanding the size and scope of government, because of course, government labor unions always advocate for more government, more programs, more personnel, larger facilities. They never advocate for less of those things. I'll give you a quick example. I don't know if I remember the numbers exactly correctly, but prior to 1980, in the state of California, there was less than, I believe, 20 prisons in the entire state. And around that time, the State Correctional Association was formed, the Union for State Correctional Officers. And after that time, double the amount of prisons were constructed over the next couple decades than had ever been constructed in California's history. And of course, a large part of that was the labor unions advocating for more positions, more facilities. And then of course, their advocacy went on to advocate for things like California's 3 strike laws so that they could fill up those facilities. So the public policy implications are enormous, both from the taxpayer perspective and then on down the road as to what happens when this sort of money is deployed by unions for whatever their preferred public policy outcomes are.
Mark, going back to your reporting, can you tell us about what you found as some of the most the egregious examples in cities where what city would stand out as a worst offender, and then what did you find like better practices, and what did that look like, if there is such a thing in this?
Well, clearly the better practices are the jurisdictions that either A, don't allow it, or if they are going to allow it, meticulously track the hours and costs. Now, some of these jurisdictions made the argument, well, it's just so burdensome and we don't want to stick our nose in the union hall, that sort of thing. And they just were not able to produce the records or the documentation. That's a stark contrast to many very large organizations, some large state departments of corrections, some large cities that were able to track release time to the penny, and track the cost of release time to the penny, and track the hours to the minute. So it's something that can be done. I spoke to the human resources manager in Columbus, Ohio, and he said that's part of the bargain. The political climate in that city is such that they do allow release time, but he said part of the bargain is we are going to track that time. We are going to make sure that it is accounted for. We are going to make sure that we know what you're doing, that not micromanaging, but we know how that time is being spent appropriately. So I would say that if you're going to, of course, you can point to the 44 jurisdictions that don't allow release time. And again, they're able to function quite well as sort of the role, as the model. But among the jurisdictions that do allow it, clearly the ones that meticulously track the time and meticulously track the cost are the model you want to be looking for. The jurisdictions that are, I guess, on the other side are things like the Miami-Dade School District, which does not apparently track hours and cost of release time. They essentially block grant, I believe it's 22,000 hours to their various public employees, their teachers union, and then there's a smaller contract for a couple smaller unions. Apparently make no effort to track what those people are doing. Multiple full-time release positions, And those unions are very active in local politics, in the school district elections. I point to them because they're a big one, but it's that same kind of practice that goes on in big and small cities and large and small school districts, where they have this, they essentially treat release time as a perk. And one of the things I heard frequently in talking to both union officials and government officials, when I asked them, well, why is it in there? They said, well, I don't know, it's just always been in there. It's been in there since the 70s. And really the only way to take it out is for the city or the school district to say, we're done paying you release time. And they know that that's going to create a big fight with the union, because again, rank and file does not benefit by release time, but the people that run the unions benefit enormously by release time. It's the last thing they are going to give up. So in terms of the good, if you're going to allow it, that's public funds, folks. You can't go out and put down a new street or buy a new garbage truck without a meticulous accounting of how much that's going to cost. And yet these jurisdictions are sending out millions of dollars to these private organizations, which are public employee unions, with literally no accounting of how that time is spent and no accounting of how much money that is costing.
Mark, we had a great question from our audience asking, how can I find out if my school district has release time?
Some school districts post their labor contracts online. Some are better than others about that. One of the ways I was able to find a lot of them in the better run districts was just to Google the name of the district labor agreements. And those will pop up. And in some of the better run districts, it's pretty easy to identify. You'll usually find a section in the contract called union rights or association rights, things like that, and they'll lay out the release time procedures. It becomes more difficult when you've got a district that is not as open and not as transparent. A lot of them don't post their labor contracts online, in which case you have to file a public records request for it. It's clearly a public document. Now, they may claim it's not, but it should clearly be a public record. And then even if you do get the contracts, sometimes it takes a lot of going through. The better contracts, the release time provisions are all confined or mostly confined in one section under something like union rights. But I've been through contracts that are 200 pages long, where you'll find on one page full-time release, and you'll find on another page a bank of hours, and 50 pages later you'll find a section on release time for grievances, and then 50 pages after that, you'll find a section on negotiations. So they can make it very difficult to find in those contracts. But the first step is to get the contracts themselves, check online. If it's not available there, call your local district, and if you have to, file a formal public records request.
John, we have a question here. Why should we expect public unions and their government allies to really operate within the law, given that they just, what our listener says is, an abysmal track record of operating within the rules? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's why I don't think the public, for that reason, should really be funding it at all. I mean, if these activities are going to be taking place, it should be the union that's funding it. To the extent, how can we expect the elected officials to operate in the law? People really got to track this stuff, right? I mean, you got to be paying close attention to know when this is going on. As Mark indicated, oftentimes these release provisions are buried in collective bargaining agreements. That process itself is often kept secret. If it's a smaller municipality or school district, those are not going to be made publicly available unless you go looking for them. Once you go looking for them, you got to find it. Sometimes it's obscured in ways that Mark indicated. Someone's going to be released for a reasonable period of time, and so what does that mean, et cetera, et cetera. So my shorter answer to that very long answer is that it requires real diligence among constituencies to know exactly what's going on, and then to hold their elected officials accountable. And, publicity around this thing is one thing that really helps in that regard.
Mike, if I could add one thing, if you're reviewing these contracts, read them. Sometimes you've got to translate bureaucrat into English. So when you see something like Car 76 is being assigned to the patrol division, or you see something like in Nashville, the police union president is assigned as the labor liaison. I mean, you got to be aware of, okay, what's that mean in the real world? If this person's full-time job is to be the labor liaison to the chief, well, that's effectively full-time release. So, like I say, some jurisdictions are more transparent than others. Some just actively find ways to hide release time.
So we have a question here that, John, you pretty much already answered. Would the public allow release time if they knew what was going on? And then, asking, does that mean that the solution might include more publicity? And that's exactly what the Goldwater Institute is doing with this extensive reporting and why we're having an event like this today. But Mark, I'm curious, in your investigative reporting, was this something that did you see other reporting about this issue? And then when you were digging in and contacting these jurisdictions, was it just a shock to them that, oh, somebody's actually asking about this and digging into it?
Actually, yes. In a lot of these jurisdictions, you contact, the public relations or the public records person or their media person, and they didn't know what release time is. So even within government agencies, a lot of times people don't know that. There has been some very good reporting. The problem is it's kind of spotty. For instance, you might see a media account or a public policy organization like Goldwater, might do something on Tampa, Florida, and you might see another one that might do something on a particular jurisdiction in Iowa. Or there was a kind of a scandal in a little New Jersey town where they were using release time, where over half the police department had used release time for things like fishing tournaments and golf tournaments, and as one description of what the release time was going to be used for, quote unquote, headache. So occasionally these will pop up in the media because of these kinds of abuses, but the reality is, for the most part, the media is either unaware or doesn't want to be aware. Where you do start seeing some coverage is when you see successes like John has been having in litigation, and because that is more event driven. But again, there has been some work here and there that has been very good. But what we wanted to do with our research and our investigative project was to try and get a sense of, not just what's happening in this town or that town, but what kind of trends are there nationally? What is the extent in the various states, not just across the U.S., but within each state? I believe it was 8 states. No level of government has any release time. So it was not the state, the capital city, and the largest school district. None of them allowed release time. I believe it was 7 or 8 states that fell into that category. There were other states where everybody's getting 10,000 hours plus of release time a year. So it just the more people know about it, it's kind of hard to explain. It's easy to explain, but when you explain it to somebody, they look at you like, no, there's got to be more to it than that. And that really is the irony, is there's not more to it than that. It just truly is. They're using taxpayer money to pay top union officials.
John, we have a question about whether there's a legislator in Arizona who is focused on this issue, but I think expand a little bit more than that. What is the status in Arizona right now? And I know you're working on some litigation as well. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So I couldn't give you specific lawmakers. That's a little probably outside my space. What I would say, though, is that an ideal lawmaker for something like this is somebody who cares about taxpayer protection issues, who cares about the structural form of government, structural constitution. I think those sorts of lawmakers. The political problem is that because release time is pervasive sort of across the labor union groups, from teachers to administrative workers to public safety, it becomes a difficult political issue because, of course, we know the left, for the most part, is in big labor's pocket. So you're going to lose most of the folks on that side of the aisle. On the right, you will have public safety unions that advocate for continuing release time practices. So you may lose some lawmakers there because it involves public safety, which makes it a tricky political issue, but certainly not one that's insurmountable, and certainly not one that, once there is more public awareness built around it, can't easily be there can't easily be policy solutions along these lines. To answer your question, Mike, about what's going on in Arizona, so we had a case involving release time in the police union many years ago, and it made its way up to the Arizona Supreme Court, where the city of Phoenix had released 6 police officers full-time to go do nothing but union work. And some of these police officers had been released for so long that they had forgotten how to perform basic law enforcement skills. So when the trial court enjoined the release time practice, meaning that it stopped the release time practice and sent these 6 police officers back to do the very important law enforcement jobs for which they were hired, some of them had forgotten how to do it. And so the police department sent them back through the police academy, or through remedial training at the police academy, to relearn the jobs that they were hired to originally do because they've been riding the union desk for so long. So anyway, we had that case going on, and we won the trial, won in the Court of Appeals, and in a very narrow decision lost in the Arizona Supreme Court. And what the court said was it sort of bought this union argument that release time is just part of the total compensation in the contract. And, this is just sort of like payment to all police officers in the contract. Well, importantly, not all police officers that are part of that contract are union members. An MOU, or a collective bargaining agreement, binds every unit employee, whether that employee decides to be part of the union or not. So if release time is indeed part of total compensation to all employees, well, that means now non-union members are being forced to pay part of their compensation to finance union activities, which is a First Amendment violation and a right to work violation here in Arizona and in many other states.
Mark, on your reporting, so many times when you report a story, it just leads to more and more questions that need more answers. In this story, what were those more questions that you found? And what would you like? What else is there to uncover? What's next on this for you?
Well, the most fundamental question, particularly when it comes to full-time release, is what do these people do all day? I talked to a couple of union presidents who are on full-time release and said, I kept asking the same question. Well, what do you do all day? Well, we really can't quantify it. It varies from day to day. The reality is they're just kind of released to go about their business. One of the issues that we don't know about is just by necessity, keeping it manageable. We had to find a way to do the research, but not, there's something like 36,000 cities, towns, and school districts in the country. So we just tried to do a sampling of them. By its nature, or just to narrow that a little bit, one of the things we did is looked at the capital cities of each state, just because we don't want to cherry pick. We want to get a good representation. But by its nature, you're getting big cities and small. Phoenix was is the largest capital city in the U.S., but it's only the 5th largest city. But so when you look at Phoenix, in some sense, it's not surprising that it had the most of any jurisdiction we looked at, with 67,000 hours annually. But there are other big cities that are probably granting even more extensive release time that are worth looking at. Even in states that you may not normally associate with as being very strong union states. Arizona is not historically considered a strong union state. It's a right to work state. Florida is not necessarily considered like a New York or a Illinois in terms of labor friendliness, and yet they have some of the most generous release time provisions that there are. So there's a lot of research still to be done on this in terms of the extent, the cost, and again, what are these people doing with their time? Because the reality is nobody's looking at how these people are spending this release time. Nobody. The city councils aren't doing it. The school boards aren't doing it. We're trying to do it the best we can, but we're the outsider trying to look in.
We have a question sort of to that point. John, can the IRS get involved in determining income related to release time or trying to create some accountability?
Yeah, potentially. The issue is that so the income is earned by the release time employee through the payment of their regular government salaries. So in that regard, I don't know. I mean, there could potentially be some interesting tax questions, but it's obviously all reported, and the taxes on the government salary are paid. But where the government can get involved is what at the federal level, OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, has done, which has gotten their arms to some extent around how many of these release time hours are being used, the cost to taxpayers at the federal level. Again, it's about $150 million a year. None of that accounting is going on at all at the state level, but to the extent state, federal, and local authorities can engage in that sort of accounting, like Mark's mentioned several times, I think that that at least helps the public get their arms around it a little bit.
One of the most probably the most comprehensive review of release time that I came across in my research was, I believe, in 2012, New Jersey Committee on Investigations did an extensive investigation on release time practices. And some of that stuff would make your hair curl. This is where a lot of these jurisdictions just did release time just by custom and practice, by no written agreement. They encountered several instances. These are official state of New Jersey investigators where the jurisdictions flat out denied they allowed release time. And yet when the investigators went in and started going through the books, they found full-time release positions and extensive use of release time. So a state can get the answers, a city can get the answers. The fact that they don't have the answers tells me they don't want the answers.
John, we have another question for you. Isn't release time a violation of taxpayers' First Amendment rights if forced dues are a violation of public employees' Janus rights?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I don't want to get too. I don't want to wonk out and get too much here, so I'll try to answer this one at a 35,000-foot level. It certainly raises First Amendment problems. Okay, the question is, where does the First Amendment violation occur, and who is the proper party withstanding to assert the First Amendment or free expression violation? So what we know is that in many of these contracts, including here in Arizona, release time is in the contract, is charged as part of the total compensation in the agreement. Okay, so that means that it's payment for every employee that's part of that agreement, whether that employee is a labor union member or not. Now, what the U.S. Supreme Court said in Janus is that you cannot compel government employees to pay dues to a union, because the union can then turn around and just use that money for private union activity that you might disagree with. So there's a compelled speech, a First Amendment problem. You can't force somebody to finance activities with which they disagree, to finance speech with which they disagree. It's a fundamental First Amendment principle. So if release time, as it is in many jurisdictions, including here in Arizona, if it's identified as part of total compensation to every government employee, if there's government employees that don't belong to the union, well, now they're being forced to direct part of their compensation to fund union activities with which they disagree, the same exact issue that the U.S. Supreme Court said was unlawful in Janus. It's just they're funding it through a direct grant of the compensation rather than through union dues. But it's precisely the same compelled speech issue. Taxpayers, and I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole. For many reasons, taxpayers might not have standing to bring these types of claims, particularly in federal court. And you get into this weird doctrine of First Amendment law called government speech that might apply in the taxpayer context, but wouldn't apply in the government employee context. So, short story, we are actually representing some government employees in a compelled speech case right now in Arizona based on the same issue that was decided in Janus.
We have a great question, I think, to end with here. And Mark, I'm going to throw this your way. So the CAR 76 employee. Sounds like the old TV show Car 54, a wholesale insult to the public. Is that a deliberate affront? Alan asks.
I don't know, but it certainly has that effect. I mean, clearly somebody actually, you got to actually imagine how that was negotiated, because somebody had to sit down and say, well, we don't want to call this release time. Well, what do we call it then? Well, let's call it Car 76. Let's put this guy on, he's on the assignment sheet for the patrol division. He's on the payroll of the patrol division. And yet he hasn't been out on patrol for years. So you got to look at this and say, I mean, this is not by accident. They don't come up with these euphemisms like this out of the blue. They do it for a reason. They do it all for a reason. And that's because they know that as the public finds out about it, or if the public finds out about it, they're going to look at this and they're going to say, that's not really what I thought I was paying my taxes for.
Well, you know, if you all are interested in reading more of Mark's reporting on this story, I encourage you to visit goldwaterinstitute.org/releasetime. Mark and John, thank you for a great conversation. Really appreciate your time here. Thanks everybody for the excellent questions and for joining us. If you still have questions on this, please email us at events@goldwaterinstitute.org. And another reminder, the work that we're doing to fight and end release time and in defending liberty across the country is possible because of supporters like you. So to make a contribution today and help support our work, please visit goldwaterinstitute.org/donate. And thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.